Hey guys, JD Payne here again. Thanks so much for checking out this video. Thought I would do a post on the latest discussions related to house churches in the United States. It's been quite interesting since COVID has really spread across this country and how churches have reacted to that. In fact, just to kind of give you a little backstory, it was back in 2008 I published my first book titled Missional House Churches. It was actually the first study of its kind, and to my knowledge still the only one of its kind at this point in time, whereby I looked at 33 churches, house churches, that were evangelistic, and they were seeing not only people baptized, but they were also seeing churches planted. And between 2008 up until about, I don't know, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, there really was not a great deal of discussion about house churches in the United States. I mean, there are conversations that come and go, but very seldom making sort of more mainstream kind of audience. And shortly after the COVID situation in the United States began to really develop and began to affect churches and hinder their larger gatherings, I remember having a church contact me. Actually, it was by email, and I had a brief communication by email. And one of the leaders was talking about the fact that the church was planning to move to a house church structure during this time of COVID, and they were interested in speaking and talking with me, knowing that I had written about this, and I had actually served as an elder, as a part of a house church in my pastoral ministry. And so sometime after that initial contact, I sent out something on social media, and a reporter picked up on that and did an interview asking questions related to what's going on in house churches. And then within the past couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, there has been another church that has made the headlines talking about moving to a house church kind of structure. So I thought, well, why not take a few moments just to kind of talk a little bit about what is a house church, and a little bit about what's going on. And so I will say this at the outset, and that is, much of what I am hearing and seeing and encountering over the past 5 months when it comes to churches wanting to transition into a house church structure, they're not really transitioning into house churches. They are really representing more of a cell church model than a house church model. So I'll get to that in just a second. But let me kind of begin by talking about, well, what is a house church anyway? Well, clearly we know that is biblical. We see churches meeting in homes throughout the New Testament, various references in the Bible to the church meeting in the homes, and we do not see churches meeting in structures that would be dedicated for worship and gatherings until centuries later. And so we know that this was a practice of the first century believers. The adjective house isn't really, I think, helpful in describing and defining what a house church is. It's not about location. It's not about the place that a group of people meet in someone's home and therefore they become a house church. What I would say is that a house church is like any other church in that biblically it is a group of a group of regenerate, baptized people that are seeking to come together to live out the kingdom ethic and follow Jesus in their local community and throughout the world. And so just like more traditional, more established, structured churches, if you will, gather for worship and fellowship and for teaching and for having communion, doing ministry, doing evangelism, doing missions, house churches do the same thing. So what's the difference? What's the difference between the time when I served in a house church as one of the pastors, as compared to the time when I served with a church that was very traditional in its structure, or when I served as a pastor in a cell church, or when I served as a pastor in a mega church? What's the difference? And again, the difference isn't the fact that they meet in a home, but the way that I kind of describe it, and I talked about this in my book when I wrote it several years ago, and that is, I like to think about the way that house churches are to be understood as more on a spectrum, if you will, a kind of a line, if you will, that could be set up with a concept of more this, less that. More this idea, less that idea. So let me kind of break it down for you in the way that I've taught it and communicated it over the years. First of all, house churches would describe themselves as local expressions of the universal body of Christ, just like any other structure of church that we see out there. But what they would say is that they are more, here's the spectrum, they are more organic and less institutional. More organic, less institutional. In other words, they would clearly identify themselves with biblical metaphors that would communicate things such as we identify ourselves as a church because we are sheep, we are light, we are salt, we are a family. That's a big metaphor that is used. They would not identify themselves with the more institutional terms, such as church is a worship gathering. Church is, what time is church? They wouldn't identify themselves as where is your church, being, where's the building. They wouldn't identify themselves with that concept. So the notion of identifying themselves more organically, less institutionally, that's a significant characteristic. A second characteristic of house churches is they would define themselves as more simple and less structure. More simple and less structure. They would generally shy away from programs, anything that looked like, seemed to feel like a program, if you will. They would find themselves as being more relational in their approach to development and training, and less, if you could say, classroom-based training, classroom type of events. A third way that they would often identify themselves is that they are more about participatory worship and less passivity. More participatory worship, less passivity, meaning that they often would take very seriously passages such as 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 26, where Paul writes to the Corinthian church, and he says, when you come together, everyone has a psalm, has a revelation, a teaching, a tongue, an interpretation. And so their expectation is that if we gather, we are all together and come in preparation to participate in the worship gathering. No one sits back. No one can just be sort of blending in and not being fully engaged in active worship and leading the body together. Another way that they would understand themselves, a fourth way, would be they would explain themselves to be more about community, less about acquaintances. More about community, less about acquaintances. So the whole Hebrews 10:24 through 25 about exhorting one another, watching, caring for one another as you wait and see the day approach, they would really press in on that notion of, again, going back to that metaphor of family, of being there to be in real community with one another. And I know other churches, emphasize community over acquaintances, and that's a part of small group development. But again, I'm just trying to describe how most house churches are understood. And then I'll give you a last way, a fifth kind of characteristic of house churches, and that is they would explain themselves, define and understand themselves as being more about ministers with a little m, a lowercase m, and less about ministers with a capital M. So heavy emphasis on all of the people of God leveraging their gifts, using their gifts being ministers together. This is not to say that there would be house churches that would shy away from elders or not be in favor of having pastoral leadership, though there are some out there that would advocate that, which is clearly an unbiblical concept and belief. But they would often, all house churches would often say that we are about the notion of not having this clergy laity dichotomy, and that we're all ministers, and there is expectation that comes with that. So those are some characteristics, just some brief characteristics on how house churches in general within the United States. I'm speaking within the United States during this video. In other parts of the world, I cannot speak into that, but in the United States, that's how they would typically explain and identify and understand themselves. So one of the things that I said earlier at the beginning of this video is that most of the church, well, I don't even say most of the churches, but what I'm hearing about as far as churches that are trying to go to a different kind of model and expression during the coronavirus pandemic that we find ourselves in, they may use the adjective house, that we are moving to a house church model or house church structure, but really, from what I've seen, they're not. They are more reflective of a cell church model. And cell church models and house churches are very similar, but there are two major differences between a house church and a cell church. And I think that these two differences really kind of help us understand what one over the other. What are those two differences? Well, it comes down to pastoral leadership, and it comes down to church autonomy. Pastoral leadership and church autonomy. So a cell church would see the life of the church primarily happening in the individual cell groups, the small groups. They would gather for worship in the small groups. They would fellowship together. Now, they would also gather for larger corporate worship, but even in the cell groups, they'd have worship and fellowship and teaching and breaking of bread and prayer. But they would still see themselves as a cell, not having a pastor over each of the cells. Again, I'm speaking in generalizations here. There are all kinds of varieties that are out there. But it's the notion of the people that meet in that cell, there's not a pastor in that cell, so to speak, an official ordained member that would be a part of the cell church. Now, there may be elders overseeing the cells, an elder being a member of a cell group, but for the most part, the senior pastoral leadership, it oversees all of the cells. They oversee all of the individual cells of the church. So you could really think about, if you don't want to use the word cell church, you could say small groups, if you will. I know that that language is very common that's out there. The second characteristic that really distinguishes a cell church model from a house church model is the issue of autonomy. So in a house church, well, let me back up just a second. Going back to the first part with the whole leadership thing. So a house church would clearly see themselves as having pastors, whereas a cell church wouldn't necessarily see themselves as having a pastor in that cell. The pastors would oversee all the cells, but in a house church, the group that meets there, be it 5, 10, 20, 30 people, whatever, they would have their own pastors. So pastoral leadership. So then the second thing, sorry for that jumping back and forth there. So the second thing is the issue of autonomy. And that is the house church, while it may network and fellowship and partner with other churches, any individual local house church would see themselves as fully autonomous under the leadership of Christ and His Word and the leadership in that congregation, that house church. In other words, they wouldn't see themselves as necessarily connected to another group with pastoral leadership being over top of them. That would be more like the cell model. So you look at a cell model, each of those cells would not say that we are fully autonomous. That rather, they would say we are connected to these other small groups that make up such and such church, that has such and such leadership that oversees all these cells. So those two things, the issue of pastoral leadership, the issue of autonomy. In a house church, pastoral leadership is there. They see themselves as fully autonomous, even though they may be interdependent with other churches in their network. a cell church, the cells would say, we do not have pastors overseeing, or pastors in each of our cells, and each of our cells are not fully autonomous. We may be semi-autonomous, but we are connected to one local church making up all these different cells. Hey folks, I hope that this video has been of some help to you in this time as we're thinking through this issue, living in these days. Hey, if you like this video, let me encourage you to share it with other people. I appreciate that. Always strike like. Hey, if you're not a subscriber, don't hide. Subscribe, and Lord willing, catch you next time.